Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're getting into some pretty heavy stuff, but it's fascinating, I promise.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're looking at the history of therapies for autism,
Okay.
focusing mainly on ABA and speech therapy. And our main source for this, a website called Cheap ABA.
Interesting.
And let me tell you, it really doesn't hold back. It paints a pretty bleak picture of how autism has been treated throughout history.
I see, yeah. What I find really interesting about cheap ABA, though, is how it's not afraid to criticize the very therapies it's trying to make more affordable.
Right.
And it's easy to just, cringe at the stuff they did in the past.
Hmm.
But I think there's a lot we can learn from looking at how those practices even came about.
Oh, absolutely. So the website starts us off way back in ancient times, back when the idea of autism as we know it today, well, it just didn't exist.
Right. Imagine trying to understand those behaviors, the ones that are, different, without any of the science or psychology we have now.
It'd be impossible.
The source points out that back then, anything unusual, they often blamed it on stuff like demonic possession or curses.
Yikes.
Yeah.
It's easy to judge now, looking back, but I'm honestly curious, what was their thinking back then? What made them jump to those conclusions?
Well, put yourself in their shoes.
Hmm.
If you truly believe in the supernatural and you see someone acting in a way you can't explain, then saying it's spirits or something, that might actually seem like the most logical answer.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense in a way.
Right.
But those beliefs, they led to some pretty horrific treatments,
Oh, yeah.
like trephination.
Ugh. Yeah, the source describes how they would actually drill holes into people's skulls,
Yeah.
thinking it would let the evil spirits out.
It's just
Oh,
unbelievable.
totally. From a modern medical perspective, completely unthinkable.
Makes you appreciate how far we've come in understanding the brain.
Absolutely.
But even though we moved away from blaming spirits, it didn't always mean better treatment for people with autism, did it?
Unfortunately not. This source points out that as we move into the 1500s and beyond, we see a shift towards institutionalization, with people being confined to asylums. And while this might have seemed more humane on the surface, the reality was often far from it.
Yeah. The source even mentions forced sterilization being used as a solution during this time.
It's a truly dark chapter in history, and it ties directly to the rise of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. The goal was to improve the human race by controlling reproduction, trying to weed out traits they saw as undesirable.
So people with autism were caught up in that, along with other groups.
Absolutely. The eugenics movement was widespread, targeting anyone who didn't fit their very narrow definition of normal. Forced sterilization was just one of the horrific outcomes of that ideology.
It's chilling how so-called scientific progress can be twisted to justify such inhumane acts.
It's a stark reminder that science is never neutral. It's always influenced by the social and cultural beliefs of its time, and we have a responsibility to critically examine scientific claims and make sure they're used ethically.
Okay, so let's move on a bit. The source talks about the rise of what they call behavior modification in the mid-20th century. Seems like a turning point in how we approached autism therapies. What was happening then?
This is when ABA, or applied behavior analysis, starts to gain traction. The idea was that you could change behaviors through rewards and punishments.
So instead of blaming spirits or seeing it as some kind of defect, they were trying to manage it through conditioning.
Exactly. And while the goal might have been to help people with autism adapt to societal expectations, the early forms of ABA were often pretty harsh.
The source even mentions electroshock therapy as punishment. Hard to imagine the reasoning behind that.
It's definitely hard to square with our modern understanding of autism and ethical treatment. But it's important to remember that electroshock therapy was being used for a lot of mental health conditions back then.
So it wasn't specifically targeting autistic individuals, but reflecting the overall medical practices of the time.
That's right. It's a reflection of a very different era in psychiatric treatment, one that we now recognize as deeply flawed and often harmful.
It's a good reminder that how we understand the brain and behavior is always evolving. What they considered okay just a few decades ago is now condemned.
And that evolution continues today. Thankfully, modern ABA has moved away from those extreme practices.
That's good to hear.
But, as the source highlights, there are still valid criticisms about its potential to emphasize fitting in over individual expression, even in its current form.
That's a really important point. We need to be careful that any therapy, even if it's meant to help, doesn't end up stifling a person's individuality and freedom.
Absolutely. The goal should always be to empower individuals to live their best lives, not force them into a mold of what society deems acceptable. And that requires finding a balance between teaching skills for navigating the world and respecting each person's unique way of being. Looking at this history, it's striking that there's a similar and equally troubling story for speech therapy running alongside ABA. We've talked about some pretty awful practices from the past, but even as speech therapy developed, it seems like it had its own ethical struggles.
Yeah, it's almost like every era tried to deal with the quote-unquote problem of autism and speech differences in a way that reflected its own values and understanding. And often that led to unintended consequences.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And the source points out this fascinating shift. Early speech therapy, like early ABA, was often focused on fixing people, trying to make them fit a very specific idea of normal speech.
Right.
But then, over time, a new perspective started to emerge, one that challenged this whole idea of fixing.
You mean like the idea that different ways of communicating aren't defects,
Yeah.
that instead of trying to make everyone sound the same, we should be celebrating how people communicate differently and build a society that accommodates those differences.
That's exactly it. And it really mirrors what we see in the larger disability rights movement, which pushes for inclusion and accessibility instead of trying to force individuals into pre-existing norms.
This source's take on modern speech therapy really stuck with me. They point out that even now, there's still a tendency to focus on fixing individuals
Yeah.
rather than dealing with the barriers in society that make communication difficult.
Yeah, it's a complex critique, isn't it? Because on one hand, speech therapy can be so valuable. It helps people develop skills and strategies to communicate. But on the other hand, we have to be really careful about saying differences are problems and assuming everyone needs to communicate in the exact same way.
It makes you think about all the subtle ways we might be pushing people towards conformity without even realizing it.
Yeah.
Are we actually valuing their unique voices and how they see things? Or are we just trying to make them blend in?
That's a huge question to ask ourselves, not just in speech therapy, but in everything we do. And it brings up another issue the source raises: accessibility. Even today, speech therapy can be expensive and hard to find, especially for communities that are already underserved.
Exactly. And if we really care about inclusion, we need to make sure everyone can get the support and resources they need. It shouldn't matter where they come from or their economic situation.
Absolutely. We need to recognize that systemic inequalities create even more barriers for people with disabilities. And dealing with those inequalities is absolutely crucial if we want a truly fair and just society.
It's wild to think back on those practices we talked about earlier, like drilling holes in people's heads or removing parts of their tongues. It's hard to believe that was ever considered the answer.
It really highlights how far we've come in understanding science and ethics. But it's also a warning. Just because something is called treatment doesn't mean it's helpful or right. We always need to question what we're doing and make sure it truly aligns with the well-being and the individual choices of the people we're trying to support.
This deep dive has really shown me how important critical thinking is, not just in evaluating therapies, but also in examining our own biases and what we assume about disability.
I completely agree. We all have biases, whether we know it or not. And those biases can shape how we see and interact with people who are different from us. So a big part of this is being willing to look at those biases and challenge them.
It reminds me of something that the disability rights activist Judith Heumann said. Disability only becomes a tragedy for me when society fails to provide the things I need. It's a powerful reminder that disability isn't inherently a bad thing. The real challenges come from societal barriers and attitudes.
That's a great quote. And it speaks to how important it is to shift our focus from what we see as individual shortcomings to the barriers in society. Instead of asking, what's wrong with this person, we should be asking, what can we change in the world to make it accessible and welcoming for everyone?
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. It's made me realize there's still so much to do to build a truly inclusive and equitable society for people with disabilities.
It's a journey, and there's no quick fix. But I really believe that by understanding how complex history is, having open and honest conversations, and truly listening to what disabled people have to say, we can create a future where everyone can thrive and share their unique gifts with the world.
So we're back, continuing our deep dive into the history of autism therapies. It's been, well, a lot to take in, but really important, and I think we've uncovered some crucial insights.
Definitely. It's been fascinating to see how our understanding of autism and how we've tried to treat it has changed over time, and how those approaches have often reflected the broader social and cultural ideas of the time.
Yeah, for sure. Thinking back to the things we discussed, the trephination, the forced sterilization, it's obvious that we've come a long way in terms of science and ethics.
Oh, absolutely. But the source also makes us think. Have we really moved past that mindset of trying to fix or normalize people with autism? Are we truly embracing neurodiversity, or are we still pushing for conformity, even if it's more subtle than in the past?
Yeah, that question has been sticking with me this whole time. And I think it shows how important it is to always be questioning our assumptions and to be willing to challenge how things are usually done.
Couldn't agree more. We have to be really careful about spotting those hidden biases that can still affect how we see autism and disability. It's an ongoing thing, and it means listening to autistic people themselves and making sure their voices are at the center of any conversation about treatment and support.
Right. And recognizing that autistic people aren't all the same. They have different experiences, needs, perspectives. What might help one person could be harmful or useless to another.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to focus on individualization and autonomy when we think about autism therapies. It's not about forcing a one-size-fits-all solution, but working together with individuals and families to find strategies that support their unique strengths and goals.
You know, this whole deep dive has really shown me how important it is to move away from that medical model of disability, the one that sees it as something to be cured, and embrace the social model, the one that understands that the real obstacles often come from society's attitudes and how things are set up.
Absolutely. It's about changing the world around them, not fixing the individual. It's about creating a society that's accessible, accommodating, and celebrates diversity in all its forms.
And that takes a huge shift in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of seeing difference as a bad thing, we need to see it as a valuable part of what makes us human.
I love that. It's about moving past just tolerating and accepting differences to truly appreciating and celebrating neurodiversity.
Well, this has given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners. It's a reminder for all of us to be more mindful, more inclusive, more committed to creating a world where everyone can thrive, no matter how their brains work.
Well said. Let's keep having these important conversations. Learn from the past, challenge what we think we know, and work together to build a future that's fair and equitable for everyone.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to some great resources where you can keep exploring these topics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.